Today, I'm going to tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was an empire, and like all empires in the world, he liked to do empire stuff like conquering smaller countries and territories, killing people, burning cities, and plundering everything. From time to time, there was nothing new to conquer, and the empire had to clash with other powerful forces for land and money. But those were sporadic encounters. Because of its geographical position, our heroes could regularly kill and rob small tribes and take vast masses of land into possession. Unfortunately for its people, they lived in horrific conditions: poverty, starvation, and illiteracy. The people received this as a reward for their devotion to the cause, sacrifice on the battlefields, and daily hard work. A group of extremely wealthy noblemen who had palaces and incredible fortunes ruled the empire. They were above the law and had the right to life and death upon their subjects. Today, we are witnessing the last breath of this dying monster, who is responsible for tens of millions of deaths, unimaginable horrors, disasters, and suffering all over the globe. This is the story of the Russian Empire.
I love the colorful clothes she wears and the way the sunlight plays upon her hair. I hear the sound of a gentle word on the wind that lifts her perfume through the...
If you are watching this video, you are part of that privileged minority on this planet that speaks English, has access to free internet, owns an expensive electronic device, has the curiosity to learn, and it's open to new things. Perhaps some of you never realized that only a few people have access to everything mentioned above. We, the lucky ones, have all this today, after over 70 years of peace in the Western world. However, things were significantly different for our great-grandparents and their great-grandparents, and so on. We will start our journey far enough in time to understand a historical pattern that repeats itself. Still not too far, because the goal of the story is for us to find the roots, the cause of the events we are witnessing today. Around 100 and something years ago, the life of the ordinary people was exceptionally hard. The vast majority of the population could not read. People worked 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, all their lives, for barely being able to sustain a living that we today would categorize as less than decent for a human being. It's hard to imagine what these people's life looked like, because we do not have a similar image to witness. At the end of the 19th century, life expectancy in Europe was around 35, more or less depending on the country. Of course, the more prosperous the country and the man, the higher was life expectancy. The average man lived less than half of the life of a modern European. If a mother had 4 children, which was an average family back then, there was a 50% chance that one would die before the age of 5. Half of all young people lost a parent before they reached the age of 21. People used to work 60, 70 hours a week, so almost double what we do today. The working conditions were terrible, with no protection, equipment, or safety rules. Thus, work accidents were widespread. The pension system was a novelty, and only the most developed countries just implemented it. The sanitary system did not exist on a large scale. Although the system was implemented, the feces were discharged directly into the water with no filters. Hospitals were rare and had a small capacity. Only the rich people had access to medical services. Of course, the medication and the medical procedures were primitive and ineffective most of the time. Women did not have the right to vote. In 1900, 18% of all American workers were under 16 years of age. Britain passed child labor laws in 1833. It made it illegal for children under the age of 9 to work. In 2022, after almost 200 years, not all countries in the world had this kind of law. What you've just heard was in Western Europe. People lived like this in the most advanced countries in the world. That was the civilized part of the planet. Can you even imagine how it was living in the East? Russia was seen as an undeveloped, backward society, and it really was. The Russians lived even worse by all standards, and we are talking about all social classes. Well, except for the upper class, royalty, nobility, and higher clergy. They were definitely living better than their Western counterparts. Compared with Western Europe, the poor were poorer in Russia and the rich were richer. Sounds familiar? The Russian Empire practiced serfdom until 1861. This was a form of feudalism in which they forced landless peasants to serve the land-owning nobility, almost like slaves. In the middle of the 19th century, more than half of the peasants were enslaved people. The Russian Empire lived its best medieval times, while the West had just ended the Industrial Revolution. We could say that Russia was behind Western Europe for a few centuries. It's almost impossible to estimate precisely. Of course, the backwardness was not uniform in all domains of society. Depending on how much the leaders of Russia considered that domain a priority, perhaps there were activities where they were making efforts to keep up with the West. The Russian women from high society were almost as elegant as the French women in Versailles. If you were to be present at a ball in one of the Russian noblemen's palaces, you could believe that you were in a Parisian ballroom. All the Russian nobility spoke French, and I guess that fashion and luxury spending was a top priority for the empire. There's a legend about Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, saying, "I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." Das ist so unhöflich. The Russian nobility cynically added, "Et Russe à mes esclaves." There were two countries, one for the rich and one for the rest. Since the first half of the 18th century, Russian nobility spoke almost exclusively the French language. They even used it officially in state administration. The noblemen accepted the Russian language only to talk with the servants. Sometimes they even spoke better French than their mother language. Thus, another barrier was put between those ruling the country and those who worked and died to build it. The Russian nobility comprised about 1% of the population of the empire, so 1% was covered. What about the rest? Well, they were not in such a good shape.
Ты когда-то мне лгала, как ты когда-то мне лгала, что сердце девичье свое давно другому я дала, что сердце девичье свое давно другому я дала.
The military was a little further back in the priorities list, although it was the primary instrument that kept the empire, I was about to say strong, but no, that kept the empire afloat. I guess that we already established that it was not Russian diplomacy that conquered all those foreign lands. Despite this, the results of the imperial army campaigns were, to say the least, disappointing. The 19th century began with Napoleon crushing the Russian and Austrian armies combined at Austerlitz in 1805. The French victory, a military masterpiece, shook the political structure of the old continent and threw away the Russian armies back into the east. We must remember that France was fighting against the old social order of the whole continent. Or at that time, to fight against Europe meant to fight against the entire world. Revolutionary France had overthrown the primitive system of European royal houses. France was trying to show that people have equal rights before both human and divinity law. France has beheaded the entire privileged class of its nobility in a desperate gesture of people fed up with abuse and injustice. Let us not forget that the world later established by the Nazis was in fact the social order that existed before the French Revolution. The nobles were the upper class, the future superior race of the Nazis, and the ordinary citizens were considered inferior people. Scared that they would lose all their privileges and palaces, all the great European powers embarked on a crusade against France. All the kings of the world wanted the kneeling of the revolution and the return to the natural order of the things, in which the rich had these privileges from God and the common people had only the right to live in misery and be silent. Russia had the most backward mentality among the great powers, both the nobility and the ordinary people. Therefore, it was the first one wanting to defeat France. Unable to gain victory on the battlefield, Russia preferred to avoid further confrontations and withdrew its troops out of Europe. The slow expansion of the ideas and progress born in the Western Europe will be seen in the present situation. While Europe will be boiling over the entire 19th century due to the desire for equality and independence of the people, Russia will continue its Asian trajectory in this regard. The revolutionary ideas did not materialize until 100 years later, in 1917. Napoleon decided in 1812 to invade the Bear's Den and chase the Imperial Russian army back to Moscow. The Russians tried to confront the French troops in an open field at Smolensk and Borodino, but lost every time. Defeated, they had no other choice but to run for their lives. The despair gave Russian soldiers the force to run hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, followed closely by the French bayonets. Although thousands of kilometers away from their country, and having the communication and logistical lines stretched way more than they could efficiently support the troops, the French army was simply no match for the Russians. The French army even rested a bit in the Russian capital. Only the winter and Napoleon's weird decisions saved the empire from crumbling into pieces. They forced the French to retreat, after being hit less by the Russian guns and more by the harsh weather and the extended distance from their logistical base. The Russian army won by simply doing nothing. Although the Imperial Russian army could not fight properly, the Russians could have won some medals at the Olympics. As soon as they saw the blue uniforms of the French army, the Russian soldiers were running away. The results of the 1812 Russian campaign were that Napoleon was defeated by the weather and lost over 400,000 soldiers. The Russian Imperial Army won the war, and a gold medal in the 2,000 kilometers run quick away from the French Olympic military winter sports. The Russians emerged victorious from Napoleon's attack in 1812. Russian military performances on the battlefield could be easily assessed in the aftermath. For the high command of the army, the victory counted more than the conditions in which it was obtained. The empire did not win any real fight against the French, and its biggest military asset was General Winter. That seemed not to be enough to trigger a reform of the army, because changing is hard and gathering medals and congratulations is easier. Russia won not by fighting, but by running away, which you do not need an army for. But they did not care. A victory remains a victory. I could do the running as well. There's no need to pay an entire army for that. Your Excellency, the French are coming. Okay, Sergei, just send the soldiers home and let the French do everything they want. But Your Excellency, they will conquer Moscow. That's why we have two capitals. Prepare the carriage. We move to St. Petersburg and wait for the winter. After 800 years of war, France was just starting its historical alliance with the English. Worried about the obvious weakness of the Ottoman Empire, the new coalition lands in Crimea to stop Russia's pressure towards Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. Moscow threatened to reach the Mediterranean Sea and conquer this vital geostrategic position that connects the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, a situation that did not suit the interests of France and Britain. The West preferred to deal with the already weakened Ottoman Empire and wanted to stop Russia from reaching its goals. I will quote from Encyclopedia Britannica. When Europe was convulsed by revolution in 1848, Russia and Great Britain alone among the great powers were unaffected. And in the summer of 1849, the Tsar sent troops to crush the Hungarians in Transylvania. Russia was not loved, but it was admired and feared. To the upper classes in Central Europe, Nicholas I was the stern defender of monarchical legitimacy. To Democrats all over the world, he was the gendarme of Europe and the chief enemy of liberty. But the Crimean War showed that this giant had feet of clay. The vast empire was unable to mobilize, equip and transport enough troops to defeat the medium-sized French and English forces under very mediocre command. Nicholas died in the bitter knowledge of general failure. The Russians again lost a vital war, showing that they could not fight against a decent army force. Fighting at home, close to their logistical base, there are stories of Russian logistical officers requesting bribes for military supplies to be delivered to the fighting troops. As a Russian soldier, your first enemy would be your own country, who was, and still is, sending people into the line of fire, poorly equipped and armed. Meanwhile, the bosses are gathering immense fortunes and are building fabulous palaces for them and their mistresses. As for the inferiority complex in front of the French army, which visited Russia 2 times in half a century, it's kind of expected. Probably those blue French uniforms solved these conflicts. I think the Russians were afraid to fight a guy dressed in blue. It's like fighting against the police. Look, comrade, a blue uniform. They will arrest us because we killed so many innocent people. Let's run.
Mon adjudant. Mon adjudant, chef.
Aïe, difficile ça, hein? Et ça va venir.
In a strange pattern, an implacable, cruel destiny, after another 50 years, the Russians would, again, prove their incapacity to win a war. Russia would start the 20th century similar to the previous one, yet another resonant defeat. the Russian Imperial Army celebrated 100 years from the famous Austerlitz defeat with another terrible performance. In 1904, the Russians were going to meet a new foe, a rising power that had renounced its medieval way of living and was now trying to catch up with modernity. Japan would surprise the entire world by declaring war on the Russians. Not only that, but they would administer another humiliating defeat, which was shocking to the Western powers. Although, to be honest, I'm wondering how much proof they needed to comprehend the limited capabilities of the Russian state. The West defeated them whenever they had this opportunity. Why could not the small Japanese do the same? While the previous colossal failures of the Russians were hard to be capitalized by those who defeated them, this time it was going to be different. Due to the limited logistical capabilities of that time, every loss of the empire meant only a temporary stop from it to get larger. The great powers of the time could only interrupt the Russian Empire from getting bigger, and no one was strong enough to send them back where they came from. As we discussed, Napoleon even conquered Moscow. However, it was not enough. This defeat in 1905 meant not only that Russia lost a strategic piece of territory, but also lost the possibility of future aggressive actions in the region. Furthermore, stopping Russia from having access to the warm waters of the Pacific will prevent any real future progress of the empire as a significant naval power. Moreover, the confrontation was mainly happening on the sea. Although the Russians brought the Baltic Fleet into the Pacific, traveling half of the globe to do just this, they only brought more ships for the Japanese guns to sink. We can see that the casualties suffered on the Russian part were considerably higher. If in the battles mentioned above, Russia was defeated by Western armies on the field, troops which were better prepared and armed, with superior logistics and a professional command system, we have to consider that the Japanese beat the Russians without having absolutely no experience in the modern warfare. 50 years before the Russian-Japanese War, Japan's armed forces consisted of samurai warriors. The Russians were beaten by some guys who had just switched from sword to gunpowder. In less than 20 years, Japan has acquired the knowledge it has taken us centuries to learn. Rittner exaggerated a bit, and Japan will prove that 4 decades later, in the Second World War, when they will lose the war against the USA. Of course, 60 years was not enough to reduce the huge gap with the Western world. On the other hand, 20 years was enough to surpass the Russians, who had been striving to do so since the time of Peter the Great, with little success. Japan obliterated the Russian Empire's Oriental dreams and cut off Russia from its single Pacific warm water port, Port Arthur. The plans to expand its power towards the Pacific Ocean were now history. Blocked by Japan, and in the future by mighty China, Russia will be eliminated from the geopolitical games in the Asia-Pacific area. Forever. After closing its business in the Pacific, we could believe that the Empire drew the necessary conclusions, corrected the strategic mistakes made in the previous campaigns, and rethought the way it conducted its military operations. But no, they did nothing from all this. Mainly, this is the way the oppressive regimes work. Not a single mistake is ever admitted. Not one honest opinion can be voiced. The only recognized human quality is obedience. The biggest war of all wars, the greatest horror of all horrors, was about to come in less than a decade. The empire was, as always, ill-prepared. From 1914 to 1945, the planet suffered the most destructive series of events since the biblical flood. The politicians of the time treated death as a game, entering the war with crazy enthusiasm. Great European powers clashed into a savage conflict, a total war like the world had never seen before. 30 years of rage, crime and destruction, a period which future historians will probably name the 30 Years' War, the Great War, the only war. 1914 found the Russian army as the previous wars found it. Poor leadership, shortage of weapons, and a catastrophic supply chain. The only advantage Russians had was its large army. Before the war started, the Russian army was composed of 1.4 million soldiers. I repeat, Russia had 1.4 million men under arms in the times of peace. By comparison, the Americans had around 100,000 soldiers. After mobilizing, Russia could field around 5 million soldiers. But there was a slight problem. The Russian Empire could not arm or equip them because the Empire did not have enough arms in reserve. If we consider that Russia had the worst railroad transport system from the big powers, we can say that there was a shortage of everything. Wikipedia informs us that it was a shortage of guns, ammunition, motorized transports, and even boots. Okay, Wiki, we might have an issue here. If you say that the Russians did not have enough boots and motorized transport in the same phrase, it's like saying, I don't have bread to eat and I also miss some champagne and caviar. If these guys could not produce boots for the poor soldiers, why do we even think about motorized transportation in 1914? I mean, Russia did not have enough motorized transportation, motorized vehicles in 1941 in the Second World War. They don't have fuel for their tanks now. They don't have enough food to feed their soldiers in 2022. To conclude, I think it would be fair to analyze the equipment of the Russian army using only the phrase, they did not have boots, period. The leadership was hesitant, probably because any sane person from the Russian government, anyone who carried a head on his shoulders, had a glimpse of the army's lack of preparation and the empire as a whole. On the other hand, the pressure coming from the top was tremendous. Either you can deliver victories for us, or you fly out the window. I refuse to think that everyone there was incapable of seeing the realities of the Russian society and army. Unfortunately for the Russian people, those who could see it did not have the highest political or military ranks in Russia. Interesting enough is the French ambassador's characterization of Baron Boris Vladimirovich Storma, the Prime Minister of the Russian Empire in 1914. I quote, "Worse than a mediocrity, a third-rate intellect, mean spirit, low character, doubtful honesty, no experience, and no idea of state business." End of quote. What more could be said? Imagine the entourage of this guy. At the beginning of the war, the Russian army had a tremendous advantage. The Germans were caught into the middle, with the Russian in the east and the French on the western front, with few possibilities to fight efficiently on both sides. Germany could not cover both flanks because they did not have enough soldiers and military equipment. Thus, they had to choose which enemy to confront first, or lose the initiative and probably the war. With the main concentration of the troops towards the Atlantic, it seemed the road was open for the Russian armies. The Eastern Front was considered secondary for the German High Command, and the plan was only to defend against Russian forces. The German 8th Army, deployed in the Eastern Prussia, had only 10% of the troops of the Western Front. Its orders were to take defensive positions and repel the incoming Russian assault. However, the command of the German 8th Army reacted promptly to the slow progress of the Russians. The Germans took the initiative and started a powerful counterattack. The speed of the German troops using the excellent railroad system of the Eastern Prussia surprised the Russians. The Germans had their surprises too, mainly that the enemy did not code its radio communications, so they could plan their moves knowing everything the Russian High Command intended to do. The Germans fought against a big, stupid, blind man with a big mouth. Under these conditions, the largest army in the world was going to be slaughtered by the Germans. In quick succession, the Russian Imperial Army would suffer two massive defeats: Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. In the two battles combined, Russia lost almost 300,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, or war prisoners. German losses around 50,000. 60 trains were necessary for the Germans to carry the fighting equipment captured from the Russians. Also, the Germans captured 500 guns. With these performances, I wonder how the Russians were using all this military equipment. I can see only a positive aspect for the Russians in these two battles. They lost 13 generals. That must have been good news for the troops being led to certain death by these potato-headed generals. Field Marshal Sir Edmund Ironside saw Tannenberg as the, I quote, greatest defeat suffered by any of the combatants during the war, end of quote. Of course, we know that now, because all the news of the Russian defeat of Tannenberg were kept hidden from the public in Britain. Probably finding out about the Germans defeating the greatest army in the world so decisively in less than 2 months was not adding that morale booster that British troops needed. With insufficient numbers, but with good morale and superior armament quality, the Germans solved the Eastern equation of the war approximately 50 days from its start. Meanwhile, in the West, against France and Britain, and later USA also, who had veritable armies, they will struggle until 1918 and in the end will lose the war. Badly defeated by the Germans, Russia will face another problem. The Bolsheviks started the revolution back home. The Russian troops refused to fight, and the front collapsed in 1917. A year later, the Bolsheviks signed a separate peace treaty, confirming the official exit from the war. Suffering around 8 million dead and wounded in this war, both civilians and soldiers, Russia will lead the top of the countries with the most significant losses in human lives. The losses were higher than Germany, a country that fought against all the world powers of the time. Its enemies combined, Russia, Great Britain, United States and France, represented more than half of the globe. Still, the Russian Empire suffered more losses than Germany and any other country.
Своей любимой.